Some time ago, I talked about the greatness of the Universal Monsters franchise and its underlying philosophical and metaphysical themes. But there is one thing that I didn't really talk about. What is it? I mean the nuts and bolts. Which movies are part of the Universal Monsters franchise? What movies aren't part of it? Is it a dead franchise? Or are they still making Universal Monsters movies today? In the online circles in which fans of Universal Monsters gather, there is an almost inevitable tendency of people trying to fit practically any horror film into the franchise, or at least any film made by Universal Studios. But the Universal Monsters are not just any horror or sci-fi film that happens to have been made by Universal. The Thing is not a Universal Monsters film. Jaws is not a Universal Monsters film. Jurassic Park is not a Universal Monsters film. Neither are the 1990s Mummy movies, nor Van Helsing, nor Candyman, nor Child's Play, nor Wicked. When people talk about the Universal Monsters, they mean a very specific thing. So, what is it? Well, first we must acknowledge that the Universal Monsters did not begin as a franchise. There was no intentional plan or collective marketing strategy for these films. The concept of the Universal Monsters is a marketing campaign, not entirely dissimilar from the Disney princesses. Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and The Little Mermaid weren't made intentionally as part of a Disney princess franchise, and likewise Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman didn't begin as a Universal Monsters franchise. There was a growing sense through the 1950s and 60s of Universal Studios having something unique in their series of horror films, as seen on TV's Shock Theater and in Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. But the classic Universal Monsters were typically mixed in with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, King Kong, and other monsters from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Eventually, into the 1970s and 80s, a collective identity for the Universal Monsters developed, mainly as a function of licensing, such as Azrak Hamway's official world-famous Super Monsters toys and Ben Cooper's branded Universal Monster costumes. Finally, in the 1990s, the Universal Monsters emerged as a fully fledged franchise with their release of the films on VHS. These films were given a unified look and logo, designed expressly to promote sales in Universal's back catalog of horror movies by establishing them as a line instead of just a bunch of random horror movies. Gotta buy 'em all. This release was followed by cross-promotion with Pizza Hut, Pepsi, coloring books, trading cards, and toys. Ever since, every few years, the franchise is given a dusting off with a new logo and marketing. Okay, well then, if the Universal Monsters are just some marketing gimmick, why does it matter? Well, it matters because words mean something. And the purpose of uniting these films under a label is so that when you see the label, you know what it represents. The label means something. That's the whole point of a brand. You see it, know what it represents, and it identifies something you are interested in and want to buy. The more diffuse that brand, the less meaningful and useful it is. So when you see the Universal Monsters logo, what does it represent? Based on video releases, trading cards, books, and online resources, we can compile a list of approximately 70-some official Universal Monsters films, released between 1923 and 1960, covering 5 distinct eras. It begins retroactively in the silent era, with 1923's production of Hunchback of Notre Dame. These films were an assortment of Victor Hugo historical dramas, old dark house-style comedies, and the most classically horror-style film, Phantom of the Opera, first released in 1925 and reworked and re-released in 1929. Universal's horror films come into their own in 1931, with their releases of Dracula and Frankenstein. These films, and the release of Paramount's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde starring Frederick March, shocked and delighted audiences, creating a hunger for this emergent golden age of horror. Against the backdrop of Hollywood's own golden age as a whole, Universal produced such legendary films as The Mummy, Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, Secret of the Blue Room, The Black Cat, The Raven, Werewolf of London, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Ray, sometimes The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and ending with Dracula's Daughter. These films were daringly experimental, taboo-breaking, steeped in Gothic and Expressionistic style, and ultimately fell victim to their own excess. The classical era of Universal monsters came to an end in 1936, after Dracula's Daughter. For one, the Hays Code came into full effect, whose rules for public decency in film eliminated many of the topics and incidents from Universal's horror films. Secondly, chaos had descended upon the studio with the filming of Showboat. Director James Whale, who had reliably directed Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and The Old Dark House, had run up such an expense that the founders of Universal were forced to give up their controlling shares. Standard Capital Corporation became Universal's new owners, lock, stock, and barrel. New Universal were looking to trim fat, recoup costs, and run an efficient and profitable operation, which meant focusing on serials, newsreels, and inexpensively produced B-movies. So from 1939's Son of Frankenstein through 1946's She-Wolf of London, we enter Universal Monsters' B-movie era. These charming, but nonetheless workmanlike films created the cinematic universe by their interweaving stories of the Wolfman, Frankenstein monster, Dracula, Kharis the Mummy, and the Invisible Man, as well as throwing new monsters and mad scientists at the wall who, ultimately, didn't quite stick. Also during this time, between 1943 and 1945, Universal made 6 movies under the Inner Sanctum Mysteries banner. Each film starred Lon Chaney Jr. in a murder mystery with weird, often supernatural elements, based on the Inner Sanctum Mysteries radio show that aired from 1941 to 1952. Sometimes, these Inner Sanctum Mysteries films are spoken of in the same breath as the Universal Monsters films. Likewise, Universal produced a series of Sherlock Holmes B-movies starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, some of which are occasionally listed as Universal Monsters films. Unfortunately, both the Universal Monsters and the comedy films of Abbott and Costello were getting a bit tired by the end of the Second World War. But Universal had a stroke of brilliance by putting them together into an unlikely and successful series of horror comedies from 1948 to 1955, starting with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, followed by meetings with the killer Boris Karloff, the Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the Mummy. And it is with these films that the classic monsters reach their petrified and iconic forms. These films are not so much continuing or even concluding the stories of these monsters. They are playing with the monsters as icons, archetypes, and tropes. And that is largely because horror shifted after the explosive conclusion of World War II, from Gothic horror to atomic age monsters. The post-war milieu was an exciting new age of the space race mingled with the fears of the Cold War. It was also the mingling of Universal Studios with International Pictures, who merged in 1946. The new mandate was for predominantly science fiction films like This Island Earth, The Monolith Monsters, Tarantula, The Deadly Mantis, The Incredible Shrinking Man, It Came from Outer Space, The Mole People, Monster on Campus, and the last of the Universal Monsters' Magnificent Seven, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. This atomic age of Universal Monsters came to an end in 1960 with The Leech Woman. Why did it end in 1960? Well, after 1960, Universal essentially stopped making horror and sci-fi movies to speak of. It settled comfortably into a role as a distributor of Hammer horror films, the heir apparent of the Universal Monsters, and Toho's King Kong films from Japan. By this point, horror had mostly degraded to schlock drive-in movies, and Universal was making more money licensing out their classic films for midnight horror hosts on TV. The final blow came in 1968 with the release of Night of the Living Dead by Continental Distributing. This low-budget film of explicit gore, disenchantment, and cosmic nihilism ushered in the age of modern horror, and heirs like Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, the Xenomorph, Chucky, The Thing, and so forth. An era that the classic Gothic horrors of the Universal Monsters do not fit very comfortably with. When wanting to sit down to a nice evening of Universal Monsters movies or scrolling Universal Monsters fan groups, I'm not looking to see people getting ripped limb from limb, chewed up, blood spurting, and organs flopping around, rent apart by vulgar dolls or Lovecraftian aliens. I'm looking for the charm, elegance, and sublimity of Dracula, Frankenstein and his bride, Eric the Phantom, Imhotep the Mummy, the Invisible Man, the Wolfman, and their spooky kith and kin. And if you like the blood and gore and guts of modern horror, that's fine. You're allowed to like The Thing and Jaws and the 1990s Mummy movies and whatever else you like. But you don't need to force fit them into the Universal Monsters franchise to do it. It's bad enough to see Universal trying to fit the monsters into the milieu of modern horror without trying to fit modern horror into the milieu of the monsters. Just let the Universal Monsters be what they are. There is plenty enough across 70 some films to explore and fall in love with.